Yeah,
All right. What about now?
yeah,
There you go.
perfect.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to attend and to listen. I really learned a lot. I was able to call into some of the meeting yesterday, and fortunately was also able to hear some of the stories this morning in terms of how the disease has affected both you all, the patients, as well as your families. So again, just want to thank you so much for including me. Um, Over the next 10 minutes or so, I think I was tasked with talking a little bit about FDA's role in drug development and also specifically focusing on the drug development for rare diseases such as ADTKD. And, I think what you heard from the beginning of this and throughout the last 2 days and more, you're going to hear this from Michelle, is that your voice in this process, your role in this is critical. You are going to drive this, and have been really excited to hear already how much you all have done and how much RDKF has done to really advance innovation in this space. And again, Michelle will really focus on what you can do as well from a drug development standpoint. So just at a high level, a quick reminder. So FDA is responsible for ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biologic products, medical devices, the safety of food supply and cosmetics and products that emit radiation. So it has a whole lot of responsibilities. And there are a number of different centers within FDA. The center where Michelle and I work is referred to as the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And what our center really focuses on is making sure that safe and effective drugs are available to improve the health of the people in the United States. Um, Within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research is an office, and that office is called the Office of New Drugs. And this office regulates the development and approval of new drugs and new uses of already approved drugs and monitors their safety. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we do that. And then, as Sorin noted, where I sit is in the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology, which reviews a lot of the products being developed to treat cardiac and kidney diseases. All right, so in this slide, you see a really high level overview of the drug development process. And though it shows the drug development process as being very sort of serial and set in nature, sometimes these phases can be a bit blurred. But really, the first phase is really discovery and sort of preclinical work. And I think Anna Greca and perhaps others yesterday did a wonderful job of telling you about some of the really important work that her lab and her team are doing to advance therapeutic innovation, to find compounds that may be effective in treating ADTKD. And I liked how when Anna spoke about her work, she focused not just on, trying to identify compounds that are effective, but also, commented on, her other the other thing they're paying attention to is safe, right? Because we want these compounds not only to be effective but safe. In essence, once the preclinical work is done and someone's identified an appropriate compound, FDA gets involved, and how sort of drug development proceeds is generally from what we refer to as phase one studies, which are really focused on better understanding safety and some what we call clinical pharmacology characteristics. There's studies that are often done actually in healthy people in highly monitored settings. We're giving them just a single dose of the drug and watching them closely. And then from there, development proceeds to what we refer to as phase two and phase three studies. So in the phase two studies, they're often done in the patient population. The phase two studies begin to, obtain some data to support proof of concept, better understand the doses we should be evaluating. And then finally, the phase three studies are the ones that are supposed to provide really the definitive data on effectiveness. And then once sponsors are done with that, they come in and request approval. If you're in the US, they request approval, or if they're trying to market a product in the US, they request approval from us. If I know this is an international group, and so other countries have their own regulatory bodies. And then once a product is approved, there's a post-marketing phase where we continue to learn a lot about the drug, often as more and more people are exposed to it. So what is FDA's role in all of this? Well, throughout these clinical phases of development, development, our role is to ensure, and this is a very important job, that the people who participate in trials, we need to ensure their safety. So that's one really critical thing that we spend a lot of time focusing on is making sure people are safe when they participate in trials. And the other critical task we have is that we work with industry, with sponsors, to ensure really that the product development is efficient, and as well as that it really, the programs develop the robust evidence needed to assess safety and efficacy. And again, Michelle in the next talk will speak more to your role in this process. All right, so I think as you heard from Anna and have others maybe have noted as well, there are challenges in terms of developing drugs for rare diseases. Often, again, the diseases affect very small populations. There are other challenges. Patients don't even know they have the disease. It's also true that we often have less information on the course of disease or who's at high risk of actually progressing to really bad outcomes. But the reason I like to show this slide is that despite all these challenges, we have been incredibly successful in developing therapies for rare diseases. So this shows you the new drug approvals in 2025. And as you can see, about 50% of the products of novel drug approvals were actually in the rare disease space. And this year, 2025, was not a year that was any different from any other year. I mean, we see very high levels of approvals. So why is that? Well, I think one of the important reasons we're seeing so much innovation in rare diseases is because there's actually financial incentives that have been put in place to really ensure that we develop therapies for rare diseases as well as our common ones. And so just want to highlight this law from 1983, which put in place a lot of these financial incentives that really intended to make sure that drug development for rare diseases was viable and attractive to industry. But what I do want to emphasize is that though this act provides incentives, again, financial incentives, it does not change, what we ultimately want these development programs to show or what's needed to support approval. Because at the end of the day, just like we need safe and effective therapies for our common diseases, we also need safe and effective therapies for our rare diseases. So again, the idea is not to lower the bar or to sort of say anything goes in terms of getting a product on the market for a rare disease. Rather, really, the idea here is to provide financial incentives. And I do want to acknowledge, however, that we understand that how you design a drug development program to sort approval for a common disease is going to be very different from how we do it for rare diseases. And I think it just emphasizes that, when we design development programs for rare diseases, we just need to be smarter about how we design these programs. I think another reason why, we see so much innovation in the rare disease space and why we've had so much success is related to some of the programs that we also have at the FDA. And I think if you look at other regulatory bodies, they also have programs, they call them something else, that are also were created really to facilitate and expedite drug development and review for the development of therapies intended to address serious and life-threatening diseases with unmet medical need. And really what these approaches allow us or can allow is really more interactions between industry and FDA. There's providing some greater flexibility as well about the program designs and sort of at what stage you get approved, and also shortened timelines for review. And again, because so many of our rare diseases are often very serious diseases, life-threatening, and again, have so much unmet need, often these diseases are eligible for these various programs that are meant to support drug development. I also want to highlight that we have other initiatives. Again, at that opening slide or one of the early ones, I showed you, this large organization, FDA, and even within FDA, we are trying to work across centers to really support collaboration and connections with the goal of improving outcomes for rare diseases and really to share knowledge, identify sort of scientific and policy issues that could really sort of, if we have these discussions, really support greater innovation in the space. In addition, remember I showed you the center where Michelle and I work is, one of the centers within the agency. Our center also has a lot of initiatives in place to really accelerate drug development for rare disease. And want to highlight that the center has also, at least to date, funded, two projects, very important projects, to develop tools to be used in rare disease drug development. And by tools, I mean, yeah, potentially better understanding of the natural history, as well as sort of, things we can measure in the blood or urine or on imaging that, can help us identify the patients who are likely to advance with the disease, as well as to understand sort of maybe what endpoints we could use. And the reason why I wanted to especially focus on this activity of this program is because I am tremendously excited about this program that we awarded. It's to Sorin's group as well as to this group from Wake Forest, and you're going to hear more about some of the work. I hope you're going to hear more about this in the next talk. But really, just amazing work that's being done to really advance the toolkit and develop the toolkit we need to really advance innovation in this space, to really give industry what they need so that they can bring their compounds and quickly get those compounds through the drug development process. And so, with that, I'm going to stop and really hand it over to Michelle. I just want to, emphasize that really successful drug development takes a village. And I think it's just amazing to see, clearly seen over the last 2 days that you guys have already assembled that village. And that's, really important. And again, just want to emphasize, and Michelle will speak more to this, that you all have to drive this. You all are the experts in this disease. You will be using the therapies when they're approved. You will also be the ones participating in the clinical trial. So you really, really do need to be involved. So with that, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing and put myself on mute.
Thanks so much, Aliza. Wonderful presentation. And we'll have questions after Michelle's talk. So we can pass this over to Michelle to share her slides.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. And I apologize if you now hear some background noise. I am house sitting at my parents' and my dad's fire monitor pager just went off, which means there's something in the local town. I apologize.
No.
But I'm going to start
Okay.
trying to share my screen for you guys and get started. And I just want to thank Aliza. She set me up way too well. I honestly think you're going to hear, which we want you to make sure you hear, a lot of the same supportive messages of what really we are passionate about at the FDA and at the agency, and what we're really supporting, and how do patients and patient-focused drug development really come into play. So, okay, you guys should be able to see my full screen now. So, good morning, everyone. Happy Saturday. I also want to thank Christine and Sherry and Dave and Rich for opening remarks and sharing your lived experience. And really, I think that is the fundamental crux of patient-focused drug development, is learning from these lived experience, as you are the experts of your conditions, and we need to learn directly from you. So I am from the Office of Neuroscience, which is a little odd. However, I spend most of my days in rare disease landscape. And our mission across the agency with patient-focused drug development is similar. And I do work closely with Aliza and actually her team, and some of the challenges that they face in their rare diseases, where us in the Office of Neuroscience, which is where the neurology divisions and psychiatry divisions sit, are battling every day. I think it's important to note that every therapeutic review division in the Office of New Drugs has a rare disease. So we are familiar with rare diseases, and we are up for these challenges into drug development. So what is patient-focused drug development? So we have actually defined it, that it's the systematic approach to ensure that we're capturing the patient's experience and perspectives, and that they're making sure they are being incorporated into drug development, as well as the evaluation of that drug, that treatment that we're wanting to study. For the FDA, some of these efforts that we've undertaken first started in 2012 through our are led what we call patient-focused drug development meetings. And I'm going to show you a timeline in a little bit that will explain the evolution of patient-focused drug development. But we were mandated in something called PDUFA 5, and PDUFA is what is known as our user fees, and this is negotiated every 5 years between us at FDA and industry on commitments that both sides make to help look at innovation and research and novel ideas, as well as help with timelines and what are some priorities for the evolution of drug development. And in PDUFA 5, and we're in PDUFA 7 now, just to give you a spectrum of the time that's happened, there was this mandate for us to have these meetings and to learn from patients directly on their lived experience. And we were mandated to have 20 meetings at that time, and we ended up having close to 25 before the end of that 5-year period. And we learned a lot in those meetings. The number one thing is that patients are the experts, and so we have to talk to patients. We also learned that oftentimes what is the most important things in a patient's lives may not actually be captured in our clinical trials and in those drug development programs. And I will highlight how we need to balance that in a little bit between what is very important to patients in their everyday life, as well as understand what we think the treatment is going to impact. So from there, we began, even though we are no longer mandated to have these meetings, we do still have these meetings periodically if there's in disease areas that we think is critically important. However, what has really sprung from these meetings is our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting series. And these meetings actually are directly from you. Patient groups will submit a letter of intent to have these meetings and run by them, and respective review divisions across all 3 medical product centers are invited to listen directly from you about your lived experience. We also have put forward a methodological guidance series, which really helps us think about how do we capture what's important to patients and how do we translate that into ways to measure these concepts into a clinical trial to support our trial endpoints. We also fund it. Now, we are not a natural funding agency, but you're now hearing 2 examples, one from Aliza and now this one, of opportunities where we have actually funded efforts. And this one is looking at clinical outcome assessments. And these are the assessments that are used to support typically your primary endpoint in your clinical trials or the rest of your endpoint hierarchy. And so this effort was to work in areas of unmet need to develop clinical outcome assessments that could be used broadly in various diseases that were specific areas of unmet need. So it is really important, we take this to heart. And one of the things we always are looking for is, has patients been included into the drug development space, and has sponsors talked to patients about their lived experience? So in front of you is a slide of our benefit risk framework. And this is what Aliza and I and our teams, this is our everyday, right? This is what we're doing. And this is the mindset that, as Aliza said to you about what we're looking at for safety and for efficacy, is something working and is it safe? We put this in every review document for a marketing application about what was our thinking. But why am I showing this to you? Because this can get really technical if you go read one of these in an approval package. Well, why it's important is we have to understand directly about the disease and the course of the disease, which comes from natural history. And that comes from you. That comes from the understanding of participating in registries or other natural history studies of what does the disease look like? What is the prognosis of the disease? Is this a progressive disease that is fatal? Is this an acute symptomatic disease? And we need to understand what that looks like. How serious is the indication? So all of these boxes that we are filling out, the patient experience is critical for us to be able to accurately reflect what we know about a disease or condition that we're reviewing in that marketing application. At the big end is making sure that we've identified a treatment benefit or a clinical benefit, as in we're seeing an improvement in how the individual person's field functions or survives. We have to balance that with risk and our safety aspects. And it is always important for us to understand what are the risks that our patient population are willing to take. We know in the rare disease community that many patients will tell us, we'll take any risk. We will take that risk if it will help us. But I do think it's an important conversation when we're looking at some of our more novel therapies that are being developed and some of these unknown risks that we have some uncertainty on, to have a more targeted conversation about really that balance of benefit and risk and what is really acceptable for patients and their families. So this complements Aliza's slide that she showed the different phases of drug development. Here, what I've done is added, where does the patient input matter, and where can it happen, and how early should that occur in drug development? So as we're in those preclinical phases, when people are starting to look at maybe the animal models and testing things like that, as a patient groups and a patient community, we should be thinking about identifying that lived experience and what are the concepts and burdensome features of the disease that matter most to patients, right? Qualitatively, how do we collect that information? This is important because we want to understand that for us when we're providing advice on optimal ways to measure these concepts in our clinical trials. In the clinical trial phase, right, during that development of your phase 2 and 3 programs, making sure we work with patients can help us including designing better clinical studies. I remember as a young research coordinator being part of a rare disease clinical trial and getting a phone call from a parent saying, hey, you know, school's about to start. I think we're going to end the study because, you know, that dosing of that medication's in the middle of the school day for lunch. And that's when my child sits to go to lunch. And now they have to go to nurse and they already stand out because of their rare disease. I'd rather keep them included with their friends. Well, had the people who had developed a study protocol talked to families, that may have been able to be avoided, and we could have had less, you know, of early termination visits from people if we had actually talked to families. And this is and this happened in the early 2000s, so before really the forefront of patient-focused drug development. But that experience very much resonates to me when we're looking at our trial designs. Patients then help inform that. What makes sense for them? We know in rare disease communities, burdensomeness of going to the clinic for all these visits and the tests that have to be done is really hard, and we need to take that into account. Talking to families is important for that. Talking to communities is important in terms of recruitment. Having clinical trial readiness within your community and preparing them for what the trial could look like is really important, as well as retention in our trials. Our trials can be long, depending on what we think the impact of the treatment's going to do. It may be a longer trial. And so we need to make sure that we're able to retain and that families fully understand. And if you note, I say the word families, because I'm going to be very honest, as a former research coordinator, when I was recruiting, I wasn't recruiting the individual person, I was recruiting their entire family into this clinical trial. And so it's really important that we take into account this overall aspect of retention and recruitment, because it's really going to be the family's aspect, not just that individual person. When we're doing our review, we hope that what's included from a drug sponsor is our patient-centered outcomes. Information or patient experience data directly coming from patients is included for us to be able to review. This is often critical for us when we're reviewing the results to really see what the impact of this potential treatment was on the person. And so that really helps us, and it's extremely informative. And then in the post-market space, as Aliza mentioned, we're continuing to look at safety as well as continued efficacy in the broader disease population that now has this opportunity for new treatment. And so we need to make sure that we communicate that the side effects, the safety profiles, what we think the treatment should be doing based on those clinical trials in an effective way to help facilitate the decision-making that will happen between a clinician and their families if this is the appropriate treatment for them. So as you can see from that, patients are critically important. So this is a really great timeline of just like what's happened in the last decade at FDA. And so, like I said, in PDUFA 5 in 2012, we started with PDUFA 5 and those patient-focused drug development meetings. And really it was, how do we incorporate the patient into the labeling? I joined the agency in the infancy. Aliza's been there since the very beginning too. And we have seen the exponential growth of how to incorporate the patient experience and the lived experience into not just into the assessments that we're capturing, but actually into the full aspect of drug development and that entire, timeline of what that looks like. So we've had PFDD meetings. We went to these externally led. We implemented from 2016 under a law called 21st Century Cures, a patient experience data table. This is a required table that sponsors have to submit in their marketing applications that denote what patient experience data have they submitted for us to review. And so they put it in there, and then when we do our reviews, we have to mark off what we received. Did we receive that information, and where can we find it if it was used in our review? This has been a really great way to see how much stuff is actually coming in. And we do use this information. We worked and have published 3 of our 4 of our methodological guidance series as our final guidances and are critical to drug development space, our core grant program. And most recently, we published our first draft guidance, which is an ICH, which is International Card Harmonization, efforts on patient preference studies and how they can be used into drug development. And that has just recently happened within the last 4 weeks, was published as a draft guidance to FDA. So we are part of the forefront in this and how to be innovative, including the patient experience. So patient experience data, just what it says. What is your everyday life experience? It's a broad concept. It can be very inclusive of many things, but we really want to make sure we're capturing this throughout our drug development programs. This is really critical for us. And I will say in some examples, it's really important to us when we're thinking about that optimal patient group. What does that patient population in our trials look like? And what information do we have? So this data and this capturing this is so important. As I said, these are just some examples. We can get patient experience data from our patient listening sessions. The use of clinical outcome assessments. I always have to remind people that the endpoints are patient experience data. When most people ask us, what are we doing with patient experience data? We kind of forget that, but they want to think about some of the broader things. But picking optimal endpoints is critical. And as Aliza alluded to, we need to be smarter in our trial designs in our rare disease spaces, and optimal endpoint selection is part of that and is very critical, which is why good natural history is so important to us. So these are just some examples of patient experience data that can easily be captured. So how do we engage with the FDA? We have patient listening sessions, we have our patient-focused drug development program, and we have critical path innovation meetings. Each are for kind of a different targeted audience, where patient listening sessions and patient-focused drug development are more geared to patient groups and ways to come and tell us about your lived experience. Critical path innovation meetings are usually for novel ideas, novel concepts. So we see a lot about this maybe in novel digital health technologies, COAs, or maybe a biomarker that wants to be explored outside of that drug development program. But Aliza and I would both encourage any sponsor to start talking to us early about anything novel in their programs as early as possible, so we can give you the best advice of what is needed to support that evidence for those novel outcomes or biomarkers that you may want to consider using in your trial. So as I mentioned, our PFTD meetings are probably one of our biggest successfuls. We get a voice of the patient report. We refer to that report all the time. And finally, we have this really overly, if you have some insomnia, methodological guidance series that I was a part of developing. Aliza was a critical reviewer and has been extremely supportive of this program. Here's what I just want to tell you about this. We have put together a cookbook on how to really capture the patient's lived experience in a rigorous way to help support regulatory decision making. The first 2 guidances were written for patient groups, how to qualitatively capture rigorous data and be informative. The last 2 guidances are written more for our industry colleagues because they're the ones who are going to have to put this all together. It is intense. Please know that there are people who know how to do this. But really it is, I think, a great example of us trying to truly be able to incorporate the full patient lived experience. So with that, I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Aliza. Wonderful presentations. So I have prepared a few questions for the panel, and then checking to see. I see one question in the Q&A, but let me just ask couple of questions that to go along with the opportunities and challenges you guys described. So in terms of the work that RKDF is doing, and in terms of the work that CPATH and other consortia are doing in the context of rare genetic kidney disorders, in this case ADTKD, what role can those organizations play in helping de-risk rare kidney disease programs, in this case, ADTKD. So how can they contribute to building that toolkit that Aliza mentioned when it comes to being able to enroll patients, run trials efficiently? And this question is for both Aliza and Michelle as we think about the toolkit. How can these organizations contribute to that process?
Michelle, do you want to go first, or do you want me to start
Sure.
off?
I can start and then I'll turn it over to you. Um, so that's a really great question. I think what's important for patient groups is we know that to help advance science, efforts that happen outside of an individual drug development program are critical, right? We call it working in the pre-competitive space, where we leverage all of our key opinion leaders, so our academics, our industry, and our patient groups to work on key research questions that could help inform drug development. And I think the BAA that Aliza mentioned is a great example of that, right? So to help us outside of that program that will help the greater good is important. I think for patients, letting industry know about your disease, what is there, development of a natural history study or patient registry can be extremely informative and helpful for all players. We are just one player in drug development, and as Aliza mentioned, we are just one health authority as well. Rare disease is global, and a lot of our trials are global. But the information that you can collect will help all of us who are health authority groups that someone may engage with. So I really think it's important to continue doing what you're doing and advocating, but also thinking about how do you prepare your communities for trials and trial readiness and what could that look like. But I think building and collecting that lived experience in a rigorous way and thinking about it early now and instead of as an afterthought will actually have the greater impact for the future for drug development.
Thanks, Michelle. Aliza?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't really have anything to add. I think Michelle hit on all the critical aspects.
Perfect. So in terms of ADTKD, right? It is very well defined genetically, MAC1, UMAT accounting for the vast majority of cases, but it is a very heterogeneous disease. So from your perspective, what would be the biggest barriers preventing therapies from reaching patients today for ADTKD? And you've covered things that partly answer this question, but anything else you would like to add?
Maybe I'll start off on this one. And I think, again, as you noted in the question, and as we also heard from, some of the stories that were shared, the disease course can be heterogeneous, right? Some patients may progress rapidly, others may not. And this is not uncommon with a lot of the genetic diseases that we see. But I think it, again, highlights the need to really understand and develop, whether they're biomarkers, things we can measure in the blood or urine or an imaging that can tell us who is likely to progress. So I think that, again, it speaks to the important work that's being done by both your group at CPATH as well as, within Wake Forest. And again, you'll hear more about this registry and hopefully this initiative. But I think it speaks to the importance of that. That I think the other challenge often we see in rare disease spaces, and again, I think it was sort of eloquently pointed out in some of the discussions yesterday, as well as today, is often patients aren't actually who have the disease aren't diagnosed as having it, right? They're told it's due to something else. So I think that's the other challenge that needs to be overcome. And I think, everything that RKDF is doing is really important to sort of make sure to educate the community, get people tested so that they actually know that they have the disease. And that speaks to, again, the trial readiness, right? We can identify people who have the disease so that, they can then enter the trials. I think all this is important for drug development in a space.
Thank you, Lisa. Michelle, you want to add anything to that? Otherwise,
No, I think Aliza covered all the critical points. The diagnostic journey for a lot of our rare diseases, particularly ones with the genetic aspect, is problem across all of our diseases. We hear very similar things in the neurologic rare diseases, right? Where there's this we call this diagnostic odyssey of trying to figure out what is actually the root cause. And so I do think as a patient group, the encouragement of trying to look at diagnostic opportunities is extremely informative and plays an important role of this because that then identifies the actual trial population, and is extremely informative to us to be able to make sure we have enough patients to be able to run our trials, and to really think about what can be done in our clinical trials by knowing what is the actual prevalence. So you are not alone in the diagnostic odyssey. A lot of diseases do that. I know that's not an acceptable answer, but know that you can help inform that growth of how to really have those conversations, which, as you have been saying that you guys have done. I think our opening remarks really share how advocating for yourselves and helping to minimize that diagnostic journey is really important. And so I think definitely the community is the best way to start with that.
Sure. Um, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A here. Sharon, do we still have time for one or two questions?
Let's take one question. I think we have maybe about a minute. We're running a
Okay.
little late, but this is such a fruitful conversation. I wonder if you can answer the question by Alex Wanile, who is a patient.
Sure. So let me read that. So Alex is saying there's like a two-part question. So what is something simple I can do at my local transplant hospital that leverages all the work the FDA has done? Get a PFDD kidney transplant group, and how can we expand the pool of known MAC1 or ADTKD patients through genetic testing?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with that a bit. We actually have had a solid organ transplant patient-focused drug development meeting. I want to say 2016 or 17. So we have had one. It was one of our actual required ones that we led, and I very much remember it because my dissertation was in kidney transplant patients and their post care. So I remember being a part of that one very much. And I also quickly looked up this morning before joining. We have had some other patient-focused drug development meetings in the kidney disease space, including, while this is not polycystic kidney disease, there has been that one and some other of the more rare ones. So I think opportunities through patient listening sessions is something that can be done through the community as well. Is there a need for an externally led PFDD meeting? I don't want to speak for Aliza, but I'm sure her office would be extremely supportive of those kind of informative informations. I think it's great that you want to include your local level transplant centers because this is where, the trials are going to potentially be happening. So I think by sharing, some of our working that we're doing, Aliza was great to highlight our ARC program that talks about how we've been able to make regulatory decisions with rare disease data, which is often extremely limited, and how do we handle that? I think pulling out some of the voice and patient reports or patient listening summaries that have already existed in other kidney diseases and how that is extremely informative, and why this is informative to our communities that we care about our rare kidney diseases and we need to know this information, or some other ways. But I also turn it over to Aliza from that more clinical perspective of what would be helpful for other physicians.
Yeah, and what I would focus on is really, and it gets back to sort of, I think what Richard quoted Anna saying, which is, find the patients and she'll find the cure for you, right? And I think that if you can find the patients with this disease, it'll make innovation in this space, much easier. It'll help attract industry if you can show that, that the patients are out there, that they're engaged, that they've been diagnosed. And in terms of how to make all that happen, I would say you have a wonderful organization here, right? I keep saying the acronym wrong. I confuse the letters. I'll try to get the acronym right, RKDF. But I think that they will be a tremendously important focal point. And it would also just encourage you all to really get educated about clinical trials, to make sure you understand what they're about, your questions are answered, and really, as Michelle noted, you're going to be critical in designing these studies. You got to make sure that you want to participate them, and you will be critical in terms of your participation as well in terms of these observational studies, these registries, because that's really going to help us understand and give the toolkit needed to advance innovation. And so I think we've taken up too much of your time, but appreciate your letting us learn from you all.
Thanks so much, Aliza and Michelle, for the wonderful talks and gracious presence. And yeah, I want to thank everybody for the invitation to moderate this panel. And I'll turn this over to Sharon.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry, we could have talked more about this, and this is the first, not the last conversation. So thank you for joining us. We're running a little late, but I think it was important that we take folks' questions and